Strong, intelligent, and best known as Queen Victoria's African goddaughter, Sarah Forbes Bonetta led an extraordinary life. Born an African princess and captured as a slave, she was later raised as a queen's ward in English high society. But if her time in England revealed anything, it's that any cage, no matter how gilded, is still just a cage. When Sarah Forbes Bonetta died tragically at just 37, her godmother Queen Victoria mourned her in public. But one passage from the Queen's private diary reveals the darker truth, which we'll reveal much later. Though history remembers Queen Victoria's feisty goddaughter as Sarah Forbes Bonetta, that actually wasn't her name, at least not at her birth. Born in 1843 in Okoden, a West African village in what's present-day Nigeria, her family originally called her Omoba Ina, which roughly translates Princess Ina in English. Unfortunately, this princess didn't spend her early years living in the lap of luxury. Her situation was far more grim. Ina had a tumultuous start to life. When she was just 5 years old, armies belonging to the nearby kingdom of Dahomey invaded and attacked her home in Okoden. Completely defenseless, many of the residents there lost their lives. When the dust cleared on the chaos, little Ina looked around and abruptly came to a horrific realization. Although she was still breathing, both of her parents didn't make it out of the brutal attack. On top of that, she lost her home, her community, and her sense of security. And she had to bear witness to all of it. The phrase, earth-shattering, probably doesn't even begin to cover it, and it would affect her for the rest of her life. But in the end, she suffered an even worse fate. Although Ina and a very few others managed to survive the raid, the kingdom of Dahomey had other ideas about what to do with them. In particular, King Gizo of Dahomey held her and others captive, forcing her to serve as his child slave. The situation was dire, and once Ina actually got to know the man she was dealing with, well, it didn't get better. King Gizo of Dahomey was one nasty piece of work, a manly man who loved military victories above all else. He also idolized slavery as a tool of power and expansion for his own people. In other words, there was little chance of this king ever giving Ina back her freedom, at least not directly. Her situation seemed hopeless, and she served him for 2 long years. Then everything changed. After 2 years, an unexpected visitor arrived to Dahomey. Captain Frederick E. Forbes of the British Royal Navy. Sent on a diplomatic mission to persuade King Gizo to cease Dahomey's participation in the Atlantic slave trade, Forbes certainly had a difficult task ahead of him. Still, even though his mission ultimately proved unsuccessful, there was a silver lining. As per the tradition of such occasions, Captain Forbes and King Gizo exchanged gifts. Among other things, King Gizo offered Forbes a footstool, some fine country fabric, a keg of booze, 10 cowrie shell heads, and a cabossier stool. Basic stuff, right? That is, until one particular unusual gift came trotting out, a young girl. Ina's life was about to take an unexpected turn. As bizarre as it might seem, given their topic of conversation, King Gizo gave Ina to Forbes as another potential present for Queen Victoria. Because of this, Ina had some sort of high standing, and would therefore be destined for an even grislier fate if he didn't accept her. How so? Well, Ina's situation was even more dire than it seemed. As a high-status captive, it turned out that Ina was actually facing certain doom. A celebratory event called the Annual Customs of Dahomey was looming around the bend, and it wasn't exactly known for its sunshine and rainbows type festivities. Rather, it featured some pretty dark practices, like say, the mass executions as a form of ceremonial human sacrifice. Yeesh, and it seemed like Ina was right in the crossfire. Forbes was hyper aware that Ina's clock was ticking. Thankfully, our girl wasn't left to perish. Captain Forbes accepted Ina and agreed to take her back to England with him. However, considering that Ina had essentially just switched owners, one has to imagine that she was probably still feeling a lot of anxiety right about now, especially given that she'd never met Forbes before and had no idea how he, as a complete and total stranger, would treat her. But she had no choice. On top of everything else, poor Ina now had to board a ship bound for England, a place she'd never been before. Worse, she had to do it knowing that it might be the last she ever saw her homeland. After leaving King Gizo's court, Forbes decided to make a brief stop in Badagry, a former slave trading port. While there, he brought Ina to the Church Missionary Society, where he had her baptized and renamed after himself and his ship, the HMS Bonetta, effectively severing her last remaining link to her upbringing in the process. Metaphorically speaking, Omoba Ina disappeared. In her place now stood Sarah Forbes Bonetta, and Sarah had a long journey ahead of her. Forbes couldn't sail with Sarah to Britain right away. He still needed to finish his duties in Africa. As a result, Sarah spent a lot of time with the crew on board the HMS Bonetta, which I'm sure wasn't always 100% pleasant because, well, seasickness. Regardless, Sarah thrived, and by the time the ship reached England, she'd successfully established herself as a general favorite with her shipmates, whom they affectionately referred to as Sally. In fact, Sarah became so well liked that Forbes personally hoped to raise her himself, assuming, of course, that she'd win over the Queen of England. Forbes didn't bring Sarah to meet the Queen straight away. For whatever reason, it took him several months to arrange an introduction, during which time Sarah understandably must have been absolutely beside herself. After all, her fate now hinged on the outcome of this initial meeting. What would happen if the Queen turned her down? Finally, after a long wait, her adoptive father escorted Sarah Forbes Bonetta to Windsor Castle in November 1850. After hearing Sarah's story, Queen Victoria's response was heartbreaking. In one of her journals, Queen Victoria described their first meeting together and expressed her awe of the poor kid's harrowing journey. Her attack, kidnapping, and her confinement to tiny quarters for weeks, watching helplessly as the other prisoners got hauled out for sacrifice. Captain Forbes saved her life by asking for her as a present, Queen Victoria wrote. But in the end, that wasn't why Victoria took her. That was because of something much different. Thankfully, Sarah's extraordinary tale wasn't the only noteworthy thing about her. The little princess managed to greatly impress Queen Victoria with her exceptional intelligence and the amount of English she had picked up during her time on the ship. Pleased with the keen and clever 7-year-old girl, the Queen readily accepted her quote-unquote gift as her new goddaughter. From that point forward, everything changed. Sarah flourished in her new life. Though the Forbes family continued to raise her in the British middle class, Queen Victoria assumed all responsibility for Sarah's financial expenditures, education, and care. Sarah, in turn, paid regular visits to her new godmother and formed close bonds with all the Queen's children. Oh, and she was super duper smart too. You know those people who just magically seem to learn things without even trying? Well, that was Ina. Forbes wrote of her progress, saying, "She is a perfect genius. She now speaks English well and has a great talent for music. She is far in advance of any white child of her age, in aptness, of learning and strength, of mind and affection." Life for Sarah Forbes Bonetta was finally going smoothly, and then she hit another giant bump in the road. Not long after Sarah's first year in England, she suffered yet another devastating loss. In early 1851, Captain Forbes passed from what was most likely a bout with malaria, throwing Sarah's life into upheaval once more. She'd only just settled into her comfortable life in England, and now without Forbes, her future once again became clouded by uncertainty. Somehow, things got worse from there. Sarah's health unexpectedly deteriorated too, and she contracted a persistent cough that she just couldn't seem to shake. Because it was widely believed in England at the time that native Africans weren't compatible with England's climate, the remedy to Sarah's condition wasn't exactly based on cutting-edge medical science. In all of her infinite wisdom, the Queen decided that the solution to Sarah's poor health was simply to ship her back to Africa. So at the tender age of 8, Sarah was sent away to attend the Annie Walsh Memorial School in Freetown, Sierra Leone. It was supposed to be idyllic for the young girl. Unfortunately, the truth was much different. Although Sarah did extremely well at the school, excelling in music, French, academic studies, and everything else required of a burgeoning upper-class lady, she grew terribly unhappy there. There was nothing the Queen could do to cheer her, no matter how many books and gifts she sent. In the end, Sarah only lasted at the school for 4 years before returning to England in 1855, when she was 12. Still, the Queen didn't allow her displaced goddaughter to come live with her. Oh no. Instead, she sent Sarah off to lodge with another group of strangers. This time, however, the Queen chose wisely. She entrusted Sarah's care to Reverend James Frederick Schoen, a former German missionary in Africa, along with his wife Elizabeth and their daughter Annie. It was a good fit. Sarah was overjoyed with her new environment and quickly grew close with the Schoen family, even so much as lovingly referring to Mrs. Schoen as Mama. Happy once more, Sarah also resumed her usual visits to the Queen and even stayed with members of the Queen's household on a regular basis. But alas, no good thing lasts forever. In 1861, Sarah's world got turned upside down again when, after 6 years of domestic bliss with the Schoens, Queen Victoria ordered her to change residences once more, and Sarah was not happy about it. Despite Sarah's protests, the Queen demanded that she relocate to Brighton to live under the supervision of Miss Sophia Welsh, and her reason was eye-rolling. Despite placing Sarah with middle-class families on 2 different occasions, Queen Victoria apparently wanted Miss Welsh to prepare the now 18-year-old woman for life in British society. In other words, the Queen decided that it was time to introduce Sarah as a sort of debutante. It was around this point that the British public began to gossip about her. The British people were all well aware that Sarah enjoyed a close relationship with Queen Victoria and the rest of the royal family, but as Sarah would soon learn, the public's recognition of her as a close friend of the royal family was one thing. Having that friendship dissected in the media purely because of her skin color was quite another. As such, her time in the British spotlight wasn't always kind. Although England was technically an abolitionist country by this point, many, if not most, of the English people of the 19th century still held some incredibly racist views, such as that Africans were intellectually inferior. But then, along came Sarah, intelligent, educated, and Queen approved. It blew their little minds. In 1858, Sarah Forbes Bonetta received a formal invitation to the wedding of the Queen's eldest daughter, Princess Victoria, and of course, the media was immediately all over it. One newspaper, the Illustrated London News, even felt the need to announce to the public that Sarah would, in fact, be in attendance amongst other guests, reading, "A command has been received from Her Majesty for Sarah Forbes Bonetta, the young African princess, to be present to witness the marriage ceremony of the Princess Royal." Sarah also attended a wedding for Queen Victoria's other daughter, Princess Alice, 4 years later. She had no clue that she'd be walking down the aisle herself that same year. Funny enough, Sarah actually met her future husband, Captain James Pinson Lebulo Davies, years earlier at the Annie Walsh Memorial School in Sierra Leone, though they barely knew each other. But given how much she loathed the years spent there, their meeting most likely occurred at the time that Sarah would have probably preferred to forget altogether. Regardless, he certainly remembered her. When Sarah Forbes Bonetta was just 19 years old, her 31-year-old former classmate, James, expressed his desire to marry her. Now, as a former British naval officer turned super wealthy businessman, this was a guy who had done pretty well for himself. But of course, there's more to life than money, and Sarah knew it. So when James, a guy she barely remembered from her dark days at school, proposed marriage to Sarah, she didn't exactly start turning cartwheels. Her response was surprising. Sarah Forbes Bonetta best described her feelings about the proposal in a letter to Mrs. Showen, aka Mama, writing, "Others would say, he is a good man, and though you don't care about him now, will soon learn to love him. That, I believe, I could never do. I know that the generality of people would say, he is rich, and you marrying him would at once make you independent. And I say, am I to barter my peace of mind for money? No, never." Clearly, Sarah didn't want to go through with the union, but once again her feelings didn't matter. James sought out Queen Victoria's approval. That's when Victoria turned and betrayed her own goddaughter. She gave her blessing, despite Sarah's objections. Sarah had absolutely no say in the matter. This wedding was happening whether Sarah liked it or not. Despite her obvious reservations, Sarah and James married in August of 1862 at St. Nicholas Church in Brighton, East Sussex. No, she didn't want to marry him, but at the very least, her being the Queen of England's goddaughter seemed to bring about certain, shall we say, advantages when it came to the wedding planning. For starters, Sarah and James got married on the Queen's dime, and the Queen had a lot of dimes. Their wedding, which the Bishop of Sierra Leone officiated, featured 16 bridesmaids and 10 horse-drawn carriages. Yet, intriguingly, the extravagance of Sarah's wedding ceremony wasn't actually the most interesting thing about it. Although most people tend to focus more on the ceremonial aspect of weddings, legally speaking, it really all boils down to one thing: the marriage certificate. Notably, Sarah didn't sign her marriage certificate as Sarah Forbes Bonetta. Rather, she signed it as Ina, spelled with an I, I-N-A, a variant of Ina, A-I-N-A. It's hard to say why with any kind of certainty. Was she protesting the marriage by not using her legally recognized English name? Or was it because, in her heart of hearts, she was still Omobo Ina? Probably a little bit of both. In any case, Queen Victoria seemed determined to maintain the prestige of her goddaughter's identity as Sarah Forbes Bonetta, so she came up with a novel way to do it. About a month after the wedding, Queen Victoria commissioned Camille Sylvie, the most recognized celebrity photographer in England, to snap some fancy shots of Sarah with her new husband. Sylvie was the photographer of choice for capturing the royals of that era, and had previously worked with many of Queen Victoria's family members. Now it was Sarah's turn. Sure enough, Sarah's session with Sylvie produced some seriously amazing, historically significant pictures that still exist today. In one particular photograph, Sarah was pictured wearing her wedding dress, symbolizing her nuptials, holding a book to signal her intelligence, wearing expensive jewelry, a sign of her wealth. Oh, and James was in there too. The Queen clearly intended for the prestigious photo op to further tout Sarah's high status in English society. Ironically though, Sarah was hatching quite a different plot. Although the newlyweds briefly stayed in Bristol after saying their I do's, James' company was ultimately still based in Africa, so they left England soon afterward, traveling first to Sierra Leone, then to Lagos. While James managed his business, Sarah took it upon herself to teach at a school. However, new fears began to grow. Her safety in Lagos was far from a sure thing. Oddly, despite the fact that it was the Queen who urged Sarah to marry a man who presumably knew resided in Lagos, Queen Victoria feared that her goddaughter might not actually be safe there. So much so that she felt compelled to arrange an emergency escape plan for Sarah via the Royal Navy, which allegedly had standing instructions to rescue her in the event of anything bad happening, like say a political uprising. Thanks? However, Sarah's inevitable return to England wasn't motivated by the fear of losing her life. Although unbeknownst to her, her life would soon be in jeopardy for an entirely different reason. In 1863, Sarah gave birth to a baby girl. Wanting to name her Victoria, she and her husband asked for the Queen's permission to name the baby after her, and naturally, the Queen was delighted. Queen Victoria not only agreed, but she consented to make Sarah's baby her goddaughter as well. Of course, this meant that Sarah would soon have to arrange to present her new daughter to her royal namesake. As such, another overseas trip loomed on the horizon. 3 years later, Sarah and her family journeyed back to England and presented the baby, now a toddler, to Queen Victoria in December 1867. Christened Victoria Matilda Davies, the Queen gifted the child a set of gold dishware, a salver, fork, knife, spoon, and cup, which honestly is just peak royalty. Regardless, it was a happy trip. Sarah could never have guessed it would all turn sour so soon. Sarah wasn't feeling well. Her cough, that pesky chronic cough, had returned in full force, and this time nothing could abate it. Although Sarah and James eventually had 2 more children together, her health continued to decline. Growing sicker and sicker, Sarah soon learned the devastating reason why. It all turned out that Sarah was suffering from tuberculosis, an awful, then incurable disease. Distressingly, there was nothing anyone could do for her. Still, Sarah refused to give up hope. Perhaps she could, at the very least, find a way to postpone the inevitable? Unsure of what to do next, Sarah began to explore her options. In truth, there were probably very few things that Sarah could try, but she was determined. So, in an attempt to improve her health once again, Sarah ultimately made her way back to Madeira, hoping and praying that the warmer environment there might help her to gain back some of her much-needed strength. Sadly, the end came swift and brutal. Sarah Forbes Bonetta died on August 15, 1880, in Funchal, Madeira Island. She passed young, at a mere 37 years old. Her final resting place is located at the British Cemetery of Funchal, near the Anglican Holy Trinity Church in Rua Cabra Costas Funchal. Regrettably, not all of her family was with her when she passed. Sarah's now 17-year-old daughter, Victoria, was not in Madeira when her mother succumbed to TB. Instead, she was on her way to see the Queen in Osborne when she received the tragic news. Queen Victoria characterized the young woman in her journal as being dreadfully upset and distressed, and she, too, shared in Sarah's daughter's grief. But they say that grief has 7 stages, and the sadness that Queen Victoria felt at Sarah's loss might have randomly turned to displaced anger. Another entry in Queen Victoria's journal indicated that she, at least in part, blamed Sarah's widower, James, for her untimely passing. The obvious resentment in the line? Victoria's father has failed in business, which aggravated her poor mother's illness. Doesn't speak much to Queen Victoria's opinion of James. After Sarah passed, James constructed an 8-foot-plus obelisk-shaped granite memorial in her honor in Ijon in western Lagos. The obelisk's inscription reads, "In memory of Princess Sarah Forbes Bonetta, wife of the Honorable J.P.L. Davies, who departed this life at Madeira August 15, 1880, aged 37 years. Aina was from the Igbado clan of the Yoruba people. And for those unfamiliar with the Yoruba language, her full name, Omoba Aina, comes because Omoba actually means child of a monarch. As such, Omoba Aina, Princess Aina." Sarah Forbes Bonetta's life was a testament to resilience, grace, and the human spirit's ability to overcome adversity. From being orphaned in Dahomey and becoming a cherished goddaughter of Queen Victoria, her journey was remarkable. Despite facing challenges of race and identity, Sarah forged her path with dignity and poise, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to inspire generations. Her story reminds us of the importance of perseverance and the power of kindness and compassion in overcoming life's obstacles. If you've enjoyed these stories, don't forget to show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Stay tuned because we'll be back with more incredible narratives soon. Thanks for joining us today, and until next time.